It's a time in our service where we collect an offering. To those attending MCC Boston through our YouTube page, you too can participate by going to our website at mccboston.org and clicking on the donate button there for that purpose. Thank you for being a part of our church family. Members and friends of MCC Boston, in Micah chapter 6, verse 8, we are called to do justice, show kindness, and live humbly with God. Metropolitan community churches are doing just that through our shared bold mission to transform hearts, lives, and history, just as Jesus did. As part of that call, MCC recognizes a state of need around the world in the areas of human rights and justice. As people of faith, we have a responsibility to act on behalf of those who cannot effect change on their own. As GLBT Christians, we are called to stand in solidarity with those who are marginalized and oppressed, to be witnesses who call attention to human rights abuses, and to be a voice in the international community for justice. Metropolitan Community Church is therefore in the business of responding to issues of injustice in our world. For God tells us in Isaiah, the 59th chapter, verse 15, that when we carry out justice, we are agents of divine will. My friends, you are part of the movement that is MCC. A portion of your tithes and offerings each week helps support our denomination in carrying out this work. As queer Christians, we know what it's like to be disadvantaged even here in America. Our queer siblings abroad face much worse persecution and even death. So this week, continue to keep the work of MCC in your prayers. For now.
Our scripture tonight comes from 1 Corinthians 16 through 23. Not that I do boast about preaching the gospel. I am under compulsion and have no choice. I am ruined if I do not preach the gospel. If I do it willingly, I have my reward. If unwillingly, I am nonetheless entrusted with a charge. What then is my reward? It is simply this, that when preaching, I offer the gospel free of charge, and do not assert the authority the gospel gives me. Although I am not bound to anyone, I put myself into the service of all, so as to win over as many as possible. To the Jews, I become even more Jewish, to win over the Jewish people. Even though I am not subject to the law, I made myself subject to the law, to win those who are subject to the law. To those who have no law, I was free of the law too, though not free from God's law, being subject to the law of Christ, to win those who have no law. To the weak, I become weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that I might save at least some of them. In fact, I do all that I do for the sake of the gospel, in the hope of having a share in its blessings. If you'll permit me to begin today with my gut reaction, our text from 1 Corinthians makes me think of bad youth pastors. I mean the men, and they are invariably men, who insist on telling you just how relevant they are, who pride themselves on being down with the young folk, who parrot boy bands and SNL references, who make parodies of outdated songs to have lyrics about Jesus, and who make fart jokes, because being immature enables them to fit in with the youth. Paul's words make me think of, to quote High Fidelity, those people who suddenly shave their heads and said they'd always been punks. It makes me think of camp counselor Short Shorts of Teen Girl Squad fame, who once said, "Now before you ask, who's this square, listen to this. Showing not who let the dogs out." Cultural relevance at its timeliest. When Paul writes that to the Jews he becomes as a Jew, and to those outside the law he becomes as one outside the law, my first instinct is to doubt him, to reject his approach outright. People can sniff out inauthenticity, and we hate it. You can't suddenly become Jewish when the situation demands, or act as if you abide by laws that you don't. Those following Paul's example here hiding away certain parts of themselves when it's convenient, and feigning knowledge of foreign matters, are some of the most loathed figures in our culture. The hipsters, the faux upper class, the posers or poseurs, if you want to be extra pretentious. And why shouldn't we reject this attempt at pretense? Don't Paul's words go against everything we are taught? Doesn't he contradict a million grade school motivational posters and Pinterest stock photos which tell us to be ourselves? Doesn't every teen comedy and after-school special tell us that pretending to be someone else ends in embarrassment? Doesn't Shakespeare advise, to thine own self be true? Don't the Indigo Girls defiantly proclaim, it took a long time to become the thing I am to you, and you won't tear it apart without a fight? Isn't this self-acceptance, no matter what anybody says or thinks, the theme of literally every successful Idina Menzel song? And doesn't Billy Joel, blessed be his name, tell us not to go changing just to please another? We are saturated in cultural messages telling us to accept ourselves, not to hide who we are, not to try to be something else. And yes, one might argue from a more postmodern perspective that the true self doesn't even exist, that there are many different projections of each identity, and that even our own perception of ourselves is incomplete, that there is no such thing as truth in the first place, only different perceptions edging ever closer to one hypothetical true definitive self, but never quite getting there, that there are things about ourselves that even we do not know, so can't lightly share proudly, but all the same, I'm having trouble with this text. A legion of cultural and interpersonal sources have been telling me for my entire life to be true to myself. And it has taken me a long time to learn how to do that, and I am still not all the way there. And now suddenly Paul is telling me to stop, to blend into whichever crowd I happen to be around at the time. And really, can you imagine me blending in? Besides, doesn't this example also seem to clash with other biblical and religious sources? Don't the Ten Commandments tell us not to lie? Doesn't the song say to take this little light of ours and let it shine? Doesn't Matthew's Jesus teach us that no one lights a lamp just to hide it away? And doesn't John's Jesus tell us that those who do what is true come into the light so they can be seen? Wouldn't it follow then that those who hide their true selves don't feel themselves to be worthy of light or of being exposed? But then again, doesn't Mark's Jesus go to great lengths not to let people know his true identity? Doesn't he keep the demon silent? Doesn't he advise everyone who receives healing to tell no one of these things? In Mark's gospel, Jesus is constantly trying to preserve this secret identity of his. So if he hides away the fact of his own divinity, I think we can safely assume that not all failure to self-disclose is tantamount to shame and sin. Of course, like all matters, this is not quite so simple as black and white, true and false. There are times when one should keep their true selves private, even if there's nothing wrong with who you are. Which only begs the question of when. Paul writes to a specific community and a specific situation. Namely, from what we can derive from this letter, Corinth had issues. They were, in any number of ways, a divided community, split along party lines, endlessly squabbling over theology, doctrine, how to observe the Lord's Supper, what to do with meat sacrificed to idols, and don't get me started on the question of sexual ethics. There were, to say the least, politics. Politics, perhaps, which dominated every interaction, seeped into every friendly exchange, and which made every communal gathering fraught with tension over right belief and right practice. It is always difficult to give these politics up. Often they are so informed by our lives and experiences that they feel like an inseparable part of who we are as people. Talking about our beliefs feels like a natural reflection of talking about our lives. In Corinth, however, this incessant talk of politics spawned rejection of who others are, and hatred between groups. They seemed to constantly push back against Paul, citing his very notion of freedom in Christ, crying out, well, are we free or aren't we? How is this freedom if you are constantly telling us what we must not do? Indeed, it is a strange freedom Paul speaks of in this letter. He repeatedly insists that he is entirely free and is therefore in bondage. It's fun to puzzle that one out, but of course the radical freedom of which Paul writes is that messy, and comes with that much more responsibility not to harm others in our exercise of freedom. I think about soccer. Any of you who have endured the trial of being my Facebook friend during a World Cup might know that I'm a fan. I've heard many people accuse the sport of being boring. After all, it is just a bunch of people kicking a ball back and forth for 90 minutes. To some, this is too simple, but I think that's the point. There is no structure of quarters or innings. It's not moved forward by first downs and at-bats. Soccer, as a sport, operates entirely on the premise that if you put 22 people on a field with a ball, and they want to do different things with that ball, whatever ensues will be entertaining. It is driven by human will and by human wills in conflict, free from any rigid binding structure. And those who watch can tell you all too well that when this freedom is present and human desires are in conflict, it can get very ugly, much as life can if we insist on our own radical freedom. Sometimes people get tackled, sometimes excluded. Sometimes vertebrae are cracked. Sometimes feelings are hurt. Sometimes people get bitten. Sometimes people are devalued. Sometimes Portugal scores in the last minute of extra time, and 10 years later I am still upset about it. And sometimes everyone gets very exasperated over the finer points of parliamentary procedure. This, to me, is an example of a world in which we insist first on our own freedom and the realization of our own desires. It is not pretty. It does not benefit any of us in the end to claw over each other, always insisting that we are free and we want this, so we must be allowed to pursue it. But this need not be our world. The 2010 Spanish World Cup winning team was known for playing by a strategy referred to as tiki-taka, derived from prior effective strategies like the German Schalke-Kreisel and the Dutch total football. It is characterized by short distance, sharp one or two touch passing in intricate patterns, which maximizes possession. To lessen the jargon, players stay close to one another, and by constantly passing the ball back and forth in rapid succession, frustrate attempts by the other team to steal the ball away. In this way, several players with a literal common goal achieve this only because each is constantly passing to another, trusting that it will come back to them. I hope you can see where this analogy is going. Were each player to panic and attempt to ensure first their own possession of the ball, chaos would ensue. Everyone would be on top of each other, and yellow cards would be handed out like party favors. It is by deferring to another and trusting that they will pass the ball back or pass it onward to someone else that players ensure that the ball stays with their own team. Likewise, we can each insist on our own way, our own politics, our own theologies, beliefs, and opinions. Each of us struggling to take hold of the same control over everything and everyone getting hurt in the process. Or we can each defer, respecting our community enough to abide by others' norms and accepting their beliefs and doctrines and opinions, trusting that when the time comes, they will extend the very same grace and acceptance to us. Corinth is but one example of the mess of radical freedom. In their insistence on their own liberty, they have sown discord and division and personal injury, and have constructed party lines and enemy factions. In the midst of these divides, Paul's message is consistent. Whatever freedom we possess, it is not worth it to exercise such if it harms our community. We must not fixate so much on our freedom that it oppresses others. Yes, of course, there is no harm in eating meat sacrificed to idols who don't really exist. But if eating said meat in front of your community harms their faith, it is not worth it. Yes, of course, we're free from the old purity laws, but if freeing yourself from these laws excludes those who observe them, it is not worth it. And yes, your freedom of expression is important, but it is not worth it if you always go in guns blazing, insisting on your own beliefs, and thereby stirring up yet more conflict and hurt. In the end, Paul seems not to be insisting on inauthenticity, so much as saying that each in the church of Corinth must put the self-expression, the beliefs, the practices of others before their own, if they're going to be a church. They must choose to make acceptance of the thou more important than that of the I. This is not a message of pretense or of feigned relevance or of insincerity or shame. It is about abiding by the norms of those around you so that your differences of belief and practice don't sow more discord. Ultimately, it's about a grace and acceptance and humility which says that my beliefs and my life are nowhere near as important as the bonds we share as a community. And if done right, in tight formation, then like tiki-taka, we can trust that our passing acceptance along only ensures that the same acceptance will be there when we need it. In our communities today, there is also difference and division, and we spend a lot of our time talking about the very beliefs that have such power to divide us. And I know that I have often failed to follow Paul's example. I know there have been times when someone said something which caused me to immediately write them off as a person and draw up yet another dividing line. In fact, literally 3 minutes after I first finished typing up this manuscript, my friend Mike insulted one of my favorite Walking Dead characters, and I cussed him out. I know also that there have been times when someone had said something which was such anathema to my theology and my beliefs and the very core of who I am that my entire being wanted to scream out. But I could also see the person standing before me and see that they were beautiful. And I could not allow myself to sever our familial bond for the sake of insisting on my own correctness. Likewise, I know that I have been the beneficiary of such grace. And I am proud of any community that manages to be family despite these differences in beliefs. It is a wonderful thing to treasure each other more than our respective doctrines. Which is why I wish that I could stand up here and advocate this way of being in community. I really do. It is a wonderful way of being when practiced correctly. But I already know too well how that story goes. I have a group of friends who always used to respond to my mention of any single aspect of queer culture by saying, "Okay, we get it, you're gay." As if I were attempting to clue them in, rather than just talking about my life, which, as it turns out, is an exceptionally gay one. Go figure. I don't know their intentions with this statement, but it always felt like a rejection. That my friendship was valuable to them right up until I started talking about being gay. Likewise, knowing how our politics and our beliefs are so often informed by ourselves and our lives, I cannot, in good conscience, stand in this pulpit and say that we should all forget about the politics that divide us and hold hands and be happy. I know already that such advice would only reinforce existing power structures of oppression and marginalization. I know already that no one is ever accused of acting too white. I know that no one is ever accused of talking too much about being straight and cis. I know that no one is ever told that too much of their identity is wrapped up in being able-bodied. And I know that the people who are accused of talking about male liberation too much are the very same people forging the chains of sexism that bind them and others. So while I would love to be able to tell y'all that nothing about our politics or our identities or our theologies is so important as our unity, I am afraid to do so, because I know already that unity and harmony can be tools of the oppressor. And I know that those who are asked continually to lay their identities aside are invariably those of us who have always been asked to do so, who have had to fight for the right to accept who we are and to believe ourselves equal. So I cannot say today that we should all abide by Paul's advice here. What I can say is this: can you imagine? Can you imagine if we could do this right? Can you imagine if our community and our church and our world was defined not by our divisions or our respective identities in politics, but by the constant call and response of after you? If each acceptance of another was met by more acceptance, if we didn't need millions of songs telling us to be true to ourselves because it never would occur to us to fear doing so, if we could trust each other enough to focus on extending that acceptance to others rather than insisting on our own, if those who were different didn't ever have to feel the need to defend that difference because it was never under attack, if we didn't have to fear that if we don't insist on our own acceptance, no one will, can you imagine if we were known not for our divisions, but by this strange and beautiful tiki-taka, passing grace and love and acceptance back and forth, expanding ever further, always multiplying, and always present for all who need it? How great would it be if we could get that right? Thank you.